Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent dismissed Moody's downgrade of U.S. credit as a lagging indicator in an interview with NBC on Sunday. Moody's stripping the U.S. of its last AAA credit rating Friday, pushing up yields and weighing on the dollar. So what does the downgrade mean for the broader U.S. economy? Joining me now, we've got Jason Furman. He's a professor of practice at Harvard University, former CEA chairman under former President Obama. Jason, it's always great to speak with you. Thank you for being here this morning. Just break this down for me. What does a downgrade like this mean for the U.S. economy, for consumers?
Look, there's no better understood security in the world than U.S. Treasuries. So no one needed this report to learn anything. But it's not backward looking. Congress is in the process right now of adding trillions of dollars to what is already a very high deficit. The debt is on track to continue to rise relative to the economy. And so the fiscal situation really is quite serious, even if we didn't learn something new about it on Friday.
So talk to me then, if the deficit situation is quite serious in your view, how serious is it? Can the U.S. pay back its debts?
Look, we can. We're a large economy. You can roll it over. You can pay it down over time. But for a way to that to work, we need our debt falling as a share of GDP rather than rising as a share of GDP. In order to get there, we're going to need to make a meaningful adjustment, an adjustment about the size of what we did in the early 1990s. Economically, that's absolutely doable. Politically is the much bigger challenge.
Yeah, and obviously this downgrade coming as the House Budget Committee last night has approved Trump's tax bill. I'm curious from your perspective, is this downgrade sort of a direct warning to Washington about those tax plans, especially given Moody's citing the fact that this tax plan could increase the deficit to 9% of GDP by 2035 when it's currently at around 6%?
Yeah, I mean, there's something very different about this downgrade than the last two. The first one, S&P, was all fears that government dysfunction. We'd just gone through the debt limit. There was this question of whether political paralysis could lead you to not pay the debt back. This time, it's unified Republican control. And what Moody's is concerned about is what those unified Republicans will do. Right now, they are set on increasing the debt, with the only debate being by how much.
So does the downgrade give momentum, I guess, to any side in Washington right now, maybe to the deficit hawks who do want more cuts to Medicaid, for example, or perhaps to those who are just more broadly concerned about the deficit?
Yeah, it probably helps the deficit hawks just a little bit. But by the way, those Medicaid cuts that are under consideration, those would only pay like 1/6 of the cost of the tax cuts. So that is not to reduce the deficit. That is to offset a little fraction of the costs of the tax cut. But, I don't think this will do that much to embolden the deficit hawks. They're just, full speed ahead right now on increasing the deficit and debt.
So, Jason, as someone who is obviously a Washington insider, it sounds like from what I'm hearing from you, we didn't have some Friday night secret emergency meeting of members of Congress about the downgrade from Moody's and how that could impact the tax plans. It sounds like what I'm hearing from you is there's not a huge read through.
I think that's right. But I do think that higher long-term rates are here to stay. There may be more upward pressure than downward pressure. And at some point, that will bring people to the table to deal with our debt. I just don't think that point is right now.
Yeah, certainly. And I know you mentioned the fact that the bond market kind of doesn't lie. I wonder if you think that a 30-year yield at 5%, if it's not going to reign in Congress, is there any evidence that it reigns in the president, given that he recently has talked about the yips in the bond market and cited that as a reason to shift course on tariff policy?
I think he is really, really deeply believes in these tax cuts. That's the thing that is increasing the deficit here. But look, we're going to be in a place where mortgage rates may be higher at the end of the year than they were last year. And that will start to get people's attention. For now, a lot of people in Washington have kidded themselves into thinking that the combination of DOGE and tariffs will bring the deficit down. And, the numbers won't lie. We're going to see what the deficit is this year. We're going to see what it is next year. I think it'll be about $2 trillion a year. And at some point, it'll be clear that this approach didn't work. Ronald Reagan raised the deficit a lot in his first year and then reversed himself and came back to cutting it in his next 7 years in office. We should hope for something like that to happen here.
And Jason, one thing we haven't really talked about is the other side of this bill. It obviously increases spending, but some of my sources talk about how it also increases growth at a time when you have consumers being hit by something like tariffs. The extension of these tax cuts might be, according to my sources, more needed than ever. Is there a potential growth story here that could offset some of the economic risks of the deficit growing, at least in the near term?
Look, the 2017 tax cut the corporate rate from 35 to 21. There really was a growth element to it. In this case, though, most of the new tax cuts we're talking about here are things like tax-free tips, tax-free overtime, and tax-free Social Security. That has nothing to do with economic growth and everything to do with what were just giveaways during the campaign. So this is not a very well-designed, growth-oriented tax reform. And in fact, my friends who are, more on the center right, who have been wanting to see growth-oriented tax reform, are disappointed by this as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to zero in on that through the lens of the cuts to Medicaid, because this is something that you have noted is not necessarily a stable way to cut costs, given the impact that can have on people, increasing visits to the emergency room, for example. Can you talk me through the economic impact that cuts to Medicaid could have?
Yeah, look, we would love to cut fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicaid. We would love to have greater efficiency in the health system. But when the Congressional Budget Office took a look at this law, it basically said it's going to result in 10 million people losing their health insurance coverage. So the main thing is it pays less for health care. That will lead states to cut back on the health care they provide. And, you might say that we can't afford to give insurance to these 10 million people, but don't pretend, that's not my view, by the way, but don't pretend that it's all about fraud, waste, and abuse. These are people, most of whom are working, most of whom are citizens, and they're just getting caught up in new, paperwork burdens.
And Jason, I wonder if you can help our audience out here in terms of what the next big risk might be for markets in this environment. I know you're an economist, but given your expertise in Washington here, what do you think is that risk that folks need to be paying attention to? If it's not the deficit, because that was kind of a known problem in the room, is it the tax plan? Is it these tariff talks? Is it immigration policy? What's the next big policy risk?
I think tariffs are, because that is the place where you can have the most rapid change. We could have the reciprocal tariffs coming back. A lot of these trade talks appear to be going much less well than was hoped for example, with Japan. And our trade deficit is here to stay. And that has been the main motivation for the tariffs. So that is what I would continue to keep my eye on.
Jason, thank you so much. Always amazing to get your insights. Appreciate it.
Yeah.